For what purpose does the gentleman from Alaska rise?
Mr. Speaker, the House is not in order, and I do have an amendment to the desk titled 533.
The gentleman will suspend. The committee is not in order. Will all members on both sides of the aisle please take your conversations to the cloakroom and off the floor? The gentleman from Alaska is recognized and may continue.
Mr. Speaker, I do have an amendment to the desk 533.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 533, printed in the congressional record, offered by Mr. Young of Alaska.
Pursuant to the order of the House of today, the gentleman from Alaska, Mr. Young, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Alaska.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to revive and extend.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, we must explore for and develop the Arctic resources in an environmentally safe and substantial manner. We must allow that exploration work to proceed without bureaucratic impediments. This amendment accomplishes both. This amendment would limit funds in the bill from being used by the Environmental Appeals Board, EAP, to invalidate any permit issued by the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, for activities on the Arctic Outer Continental Shelf, OCS. The EPA is an extension of the EPA that hears administrative appeals pertaining to permit decisions and civil penalties.
I at least want to hear what the gentleman...
The gentleman will suspend. The committee is not in order. Would the members please take their conversations off the floor? The gentleman deserves to be heard. The gentleman from Alaska may continue.
The EPA is an extension of the EPA that hears administrative appeals pertaining to permit decisions and civil penalties decisions of the agency. Very frankly, EPA is populated by environmental appeals judges who are lawyers associated with EPA or Justice Department. This amendment does not circumvent the EPA's authority. Instead, it continues to give permitting decisions to the professionals in the regional offices. What this amendment will do is remove the ability for lawyers to overrule EPA permit writers. Over $40 billion have been invested in trying to drill exploratory wells to a date, and not a single well has been drilled because of EPA air permits. Mr. Speaker, if I must say, this is an example where an agency is trying to issue the permits correctly, but they have a board that can listen to someone who objects to it that rules against them. And we have, in fact, had a little over 680 leases in the Arctic Ocean. Oil that we need being held up by bureaucrats. We will do this safely. The air will be clean. They're 80 miles from any human, other than those that work on these ships. And if you believe it's right to buy this oil from overseas, shame on you. Again, we are spending close to $40 billion this year or more buying foreign oil. 72% of our oil is coming from overseas. The right thing to do is allow us to take and explore and find out if that oil is there, and if it is, to develop it. Now remember, we're not the only ones in the Arctic anymore. Iceland, Greenland, China, Russia are all drilling. We're the only ones not involved, yet we have the best equipment, the best environmental records in the Arctic. We have the proper equipment to do it safely. It's being held up by bureaucrats that don't want to issue the permits. EPA has said it's all right, but the review board says no, it's not, within the agencies itself. All this says, if they have the permit issued, then it should go forth, and let's get on to serving this country as we should, for the benefit of this nation, for the benefit of those, so we don't have to go to war over in the Middle East over oil. So if you don't like what's going on there, let's support this amendment. I believe it's the correct thing, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. For what purpose the gentleman from Virginia rise?
Mr. Chairman, I rise to claim the time in opposition.
The gentleman is recognized 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The gentleman's amendment stops funding for, and I will quote, the Environmental Appeals Board to consider, review, reject, remand, or otherwise invalidate any permit issued for outer continental shelf sources located offshore of the states along the Arctic coast. Now, the gentleman has shared with us a specific situation, but his amendment goes considerably beyond that. The appeals board is the final decision maker on administrative appeals under all major environmental statutes that the Environmental Protection Agency administers. It's an impartial body, independent of all agency components outside the immediate office of the administrator. To support this amendment is to take away people's right to petition their government. This is an impartial board that looks out for the regular citizen. In fact, they just took great care and ruled on the side of Alaskans and courageously ruled against EPA's issuance of a permit to shell oil. I thought the gentleman and his side of the aisle would take sincere joy in any decision ruling against EPA. But that's not the case, apparently. I guess EPA is okay as long as it doesn't use any federal funds and rules exactly the way that you want them to. And in fact, EPA did rule the way that the gentleman wants. It's just that we have an appeals board. That appeals board is there for good reason, has been for some time. Now, I don't have to tell the gentleman, but I think the other members of this body should know that the Environmental Appeals Board found that EPA's analysis of the effect on Alaskan Native communities of nitrogen dioxide emissions from the drilling ships was too limited, ordered the agency to redo the work. It doesn't mean that they can't drill. The analysis is incomplete. We should let that legal process work and stop interfering in long-standing regulatory and administrative processes. The amendment will be seen as an assault on the environment and an affront to the Alaskans who engaged in this case. I'm disappointed that the gentleman's position would appear to favor big oil over the small Alaskan villages that are being protected in this reconsideration. It doesn't mean that there won't be drilling. It simply means that the analysis to enable that drilling needs to be full and complete. And at this point, I would urge defeat of the amendment and reserve the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman reserves.
Parliamentary inquiry. How much time do I have left?
The gentleman from Alaska has 2 minutes left.
2 minutes left. I'll take 30 seconds. I want to suggest one thing. The Native communities in Alaska support this. They support drilling. I've had them in my office. And to say that, I represent that state, not Alexander, Virginia. And they've come to me and say, we need it. So at this time, I yield to the gentleman, the chairman of the Appropriation Committee, Mr. Simpson.
The gentleman from Idaho is recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Beginning in 2005, the Shell Oil Company purchased leases in the Beaufort and the Chukchi Seas located within the Arctic Outer Continental Shelf. The company paid over $2.1 billion for these leases, these lease rights, a reflection of the potentially vast reserves off Alaska's coast. Shell applied for air permits from the EPA for its Beaufort leases in 2006 and for the Chukchi in 2008. The company went through a lengthy and burdensome administrative process. Shell's permits were initially approved, but subsequently overturned by the EPA's Environmental Appeal Board. Last year, the Appropriations Committee addressed the problem by including language in the FY 2010 conference report, specifically directing the agency to allocate sufficient funds and personnel to process the OCS permits in a timely manner. This simply did not happen. The company is effectively at square one after spending millions of dollars and thousands of man-hours. Shell announced just this month that it had canceled plans for drilling in the Arctic in the 2011 drilling season, which is a very short drilling season. They have spent millions on this and done everything by the book. And the appeals board has decided that because they should have foreseen that the rules were going to change, that they shouldn't have issued these air permits. I think it's an overreach by the EPA and by the appeals board, and I support this amendment and would encourage my colleagues to vote for it.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Virginia.